Ethan had learned early that offices had two lives, one loud and public, the other quiet and honest, and on that late evening the quiet life had taken over the downtown Chicago firm where he worked, with most floors dark and only the hum of the city slipping through the tall windows, and he was still at his desk because he believed hard work was the only safe way forward for someone like him, a junior associate from a small Michigan town who still felt like a visitor in a world of glass walls and careful smiles. And the reason he stayed was simple: a file that belonged to Margaret Collins, the senior partner everyone respected, feared a little, and admired a lot, a woman known for sharp thinking and calm authority, someone people spoke to carefully, calling her ma'am without thinking. And Ethan reviewed the file once more before standing, knowing it could wait until morning but also knowing he would not sleep well if he did not bring it to her now. And as he walked down the quiet hallway he noticed how different the place felt after hours, less like a machine and more like a space where real people stayed behind with their thoughts. And when he knocked on her door he expected a quick exchange, a polite thank you, and a return to silence, but when she said come in her voice sounded tired in a human way, not distant or sharp, and inside her office the lights were softer, her jacket was gone, her sleeves rolled up, and the city lights framed her like a still picture, and she looked up at him with a small smile that surprised him because it was not the professional one he saw in meetings. It was warmer, almost personal, and she said you're still here, and he answered yes ma'am without thinking, because that word had become a habit tied to survival, and she took the file, skimmed it quickly, and nodded, but then she paused, leaning back slightly, studying him not as an employee but as a person who had stayed late, who cared enough to walk down a dark hallway, and the room seemed to slow as she said quietly after hours you don't have to call me ma'am just use my name, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because a name carries closeness and choice, and Ethan felt unsure where to put his hands or his thoughts, and he nodded, saying okay, then saying Margaret, testing the sound like it might break something, and she smiled again, not big or dramatic, but real, and that smile shifted the space between them, making it feel smaller, more open. And they talked then, briefly at first, about the file, about a point he had noticed, and she listened closely, not interrupting, and he realized she was not just letting him speak, she was inviting it, and that mattered more than praise. And when she thanked him she used his name too, Ethan, not Mr. or Associate, just Ethan, and that simple exchange stayed with him as he walked back to his desk, because nothing inappropriate had happened, nothing crossed a line, and yet something had changed. Something quiet and personal had begun without permission, and as he packed his bag and headed for the elevator he replayed the moment again and again, not because of what was said, but because of how it felt, like a door had opened slightly inside a place he thought was sealed shut, and outside the building the night air was cool and steady, and he walked toward the train thinking about how careful rules were meant to protect people, and how sometimes they also hid the truth, and he wondered if Margaret had felt the same shift or if it was just him reading meaning into kindness. But when he glanced back up at the building and saw the light still on in her office he felt a quiet connection stretch across the floors, fragile and unspoken, and he understood that this was not a story of action but of attention, of a moment that could easily be forgotten yet refused to be, because first moments do not always announce themselves, they slip in softly, wearing ordinary words, and later you realize they were the beginning. And as Ethan boarded the train and watched the city blur past, he felt something new settle into his chest, not hope exactly, and not fear, but awareness, the kind that wakes you up and tells you that tomorrow will not feel the same, because once someone invites you to say their name, the world quietly rearranges itself around that choice. After that night, the days moved faster but the evenings slowed down, and Ethan noticed how something quiet followed him through the office like a soft echo. Because during meetings Margaret Collins was unchanged, sharp voice, steady hands, clear decisions, and everyone still called her Ms. Collins or ma'am, including Ethan, who kept his tone careful in front of others. But once the office emptied and the lights dimmed, the air shifted again, and those moments after hours became small islands of honesty where rules softened without breaking, and it started with short conversations that grew longer without planning, sometimes in her office doorway, sometimes by the coffee machine that made terrible coffee but somehow became familiar, and they spoke about simple things first, deadlines, weather, city traffic, but slowly the topics deepened as trust built quietly, and Margaret shared that she rarely stayed late because she loved work but because going home to an empty apartment felt heavier than staying busy, and Ethan admitted that the city still felt too big for him, that success had come faster than comfort. And she listened in a way that made him feel seen, not judged, and he learned that she grew up near the coast, that she missed open skies, that she once thought success would feel louder than it did, and these details mattered because they belonged to the person behind the title, and with each shared story, the distance between them shortened, not physically but emotionally, and Ethan became aware of small things, how Margaret paused before speaking when something mattered, how she smiled with only one side of her mouth when she was unsure, and she noticed him too, how he stayed calm under pressure, how he never rushed her thoughts, how he asked questions instead of trying to impress, and none of this felt dramatic, it felt natural, which made it more dangerous, because comfort can quietly turn into longing without asking permission, and some evenings they worked side by side in silence, not needing to fill it, and the city lights outside became part of the background of something neither wanted to name, and Ethan began to look forward to those hours not because of attraction alone but because he felt understood, and Margaret felt something similar, though she tried to keep it controlled, reminding herself of boundaries, of experience, of consequences, but feelings do not disappear just because you recognize them, and one night, as rain streaked the windows and the building felt almost empty, Margaret admitted that leadership often felt lonely, that being strong all the time left little room for softness, and Ethan told her that he often felt invisible. Despite working so hard, and in that exchange something fragile formed, a shared understanding that did not need touch or promise, and yet both were aware of the unspoken line running between them, thin but firm, and they stepped carefully around it, choosing words wisely, ending conversations before they grew too heavy, but the restraint itself carried weight, because holding back can be just as emotional as acting, and Ethan found himself thinking about her outside work, wondering if she was eating dinner alone, if she was tired, if she felt the same pull, and Margaret found herself pausing before sleep, replaying conversations, wondering when professional respect had turned into something more personal, and still nothing crossed the line, no confessions, no promises, just presence, and that presence slowly rewrote how they saw each other, not as roles but as people standing at different points in life yet sharing the same quiet need to be understood, and as weeks passed the after hours moments became fewer but more meaningful, because both sensed that something was building, and neither knew how long they could keep pretending it was harmless, and one evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, Margaret thanked him for staying late again, her voice softer than usual, and when he replied using her name without hesitation, she didn't correct him, she didn't step back, she simply nodded, accepting the closeness in that word, and as the elevator doors closed behind him, Ethan felt a mix of calm and tension, because part of him knew that this connection was real and rare, and another part knew that real things often ask for hard choices, and somewhere above him, in her quiet office, Margaret stood by the window longer than usual, watching the city glow, aware that something meaningful was growing in the spaces between what they said and what they carefully left unsaid, and she wondered how long they could stay in this careful balance before truth demanded more. The invitation came unexpectedly, a casual remark in passing that carried weight neither of them could ignore, when Margaret mentioned that a few colleagues were going to dinner on Friday and that Ethan was welcome to join, and he felt a surge of anticipation he tried to mask as casual interest, knowing that being around her outside the office would shift the air between them in ways neither rules nor titles could contain, and when Friday arrived the workday stretched endlessly, meetings ran late, and every minute felt heavier with the thought of seeing her beyond fluorescent lights and deadlines, and as they entered the small, quiet restaurant downtown, the atmosphere immediately softened, the hum of conversation around them fading into background as if the city had agreed to let this evening belong only to them, and they talked for hours, not about work but about life, dreams, regrets, favorite places, childhood memories, moments that made them laugh and moments that made them pause, and the conversation flowed naturally, with pauses that felt comfortable, silences that were not empty, and each revelation about themselves deepened the fragile intimacy, Ethan noticing how her eyes softened when she laughed, how her hands moved without pretense, how her voice carried tones he had never heard in boardrooms, and Margaret noticing the way he listened, how he responded thoughtfully, how he didn't try to impress, how he asked questions because he genuinely wanted to know her, and at one point, as the evening grew quieter and the lights dimmed, she reached for her glass and her hand brushed his across the table, a touch brief but electrifying, and neither pulled away immediately, and time seemed to stretch so that every heartbeat counted, the restaurant fading completely until only the two of them remained, and the pull between them became undeniable, something quiet yet urgent, and Ethan wanted to say more, to reach out, to close the gap that had grown steadily over weeks of shared after-hours moments. And Margaret felt the same, a mixture of thrill and caution, knowing that acting on it could change everything, and she whispered softly, almost to herself, "This is dangerous," and Ethan nodded, understanding not just the words but the weight behind them, acknowledging that feelings could complicate lives, careers, and hearts, yet the honesty of the moment was irresistible, because it was real and fragile and unguarded, and she added that it felt honest, and he smiled, because the simple truth of her statement captured everything they had been feeling, and then, before the night could tip into uncharted territory, she stood, her movement deliberate, pulling the conversation back into safety, and said we should go, and outside the restaurant the city was cold, crisp, full of streetlights reflecting on wet pavement, and they walked a few steps apart, the air between them charged yet restrained, and when Ethan said good night, Margaret didn't reply with titles or distance, just a soft acknowledgement, and she turned away before he could see the vulnerability hiding behind her composed exterior, and as he watched her disappear into the night, he felt a mix of longing and restraint, knowing that some moments are not meant to be fully claimed, only remembered, and both of them went home carrying the weight of possibility, aware that the connection they shared had grown deeper without a single word of promise, aware that this night, more than any late work hour, had exposed the true complexity of what they felt for each other. And neither slept easily, each mind replaying smiles, touches, words, and silences, knowing that something powerful had begun. And it had begun quietly, between laughter, glances, and the gentle insistence of being fully seen, and as the city rested under streetlights, Ethan and Margaret were both awake in thought, aware that the next encounter could either deepen the bond or force them to retreat, and that uncertainty, thrilling and frightening, was the very thing that made their story real. Weeks passed after that quiet, charged dinner, and life at the office resumed its usual rhythm, but the invisible thread between Ethan and Margaret remained, taut and unspoken, a presence that made ordinary moments feel different, heavier with meaning, and then the news came that Margaret had requested a transfer to a different department within the same city, a move that was professional, clean, and necessary, and when Ethan learned of it, a mix of emotions surged. Relief that boundaries would be clearer, sadness that after-hours conversations and shared moments would become rarer, and an unexpected tenderness for the person who had unknowingly become part of his routine, and on his last day working directly under her, the office emptied faster than usual, leaving only the two of them in the quiet light of evening, and she approached his desk with measured steps, careful but with warmth in her eyes, and said simply that she didn't leave because of him, that her decision had been driven by circumstances, by the need to grow professionally, but she added softly that feelings had played a role, feelings she could not ignore, and Ethan felt his chest tighten with understanding, because he knew he had felt the same, the slow pull of connection that had grown in shared smiles, in words spoken after hours, in the quiet attentions neither had named, and they stood together in silence, aware of everything unsaid, the hum of computers, the faint light from the street below, the office that had witnessed the start of something neither had claimed. And Margaret continued, her voice low, saying that she hoped one day, if the timing was kinder, they might meet again under different circumstances, and Ethan smiled, a mixture of gratitude and sadness, telling her that when that day came, he would call her Margaret without hesitation, as if that simple permission had been a gift between them, and she returned the smile, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been, of restraint, of mutual care, of emotions held without crossing lines. And then they walked in opposite directions, out of the office and into their separate lives, carrying a shared memory that was powerful not because it had been dramatic or reckless, but because it had been honest, because they had seen each other fully, allowed themselves to be vulnerable in small ways, and respected each other's choices, and in that parting, Ethan felt a deep change, an awareness that not all love stories need to end with hands held or confessions made, that sometimes the greatest depth comes from restraint, from understanding timing, from holding respect as fiercely as desire, and Margaret, watching him disappear down the hall, felt the same, a soft ache mingled with quiet pride for the bond they had cultivated, and as days turned into weeks, both carried forward the lessons of what they had shared, knowing that some moments define us not by what they are, but by what they allow us to become, and that even without promises or touch, the heart remembers the kindness, the attention, the invitation to speak freely, and the courage it takes to honor both feeling and circumstance. And in the echo of that final conversation, both Ethan and Margaret understood that they had experienced something rare, a connection built on respect, honesty, and timing, a connection that would linger in memory and influence the way they approached the world and relationships, shaping their choices with a quiet, emotional maturity, proving that love can be profound even when unspoken, powerful even when restrained, and unforgettable even when it must pause. And as each returned to their separate paths, the world outside the office continued as usual, unaware of the delicate story that had unfolded within those walls, a story of longing, of gentle attraction, of hearts learning patience and understanding, and both of them, in their own ways, carried forward the quiet hope that life might one day allow them to meet again, fully, freely, and with timing finally on their side, knowing that some beginnings do not require endings to matter.